Hey everyone, welcome back to Daily Downshift. I'm your host Nestor, and today we have some massive news in regards to the 2020 Corvette C8. Motortrend just put out an article that features a video which claims the base Stingray's horsepower and torque is severely underrated by Chevrolet. The numbers that Chevrolet gave us were 495 crank horsepower and 470 pound-feet of torque, and the numbers that Motortrend saw on the dyno runs after many runs was 561 wheel horsepower and 515 pound-feet of torque at its very best run. They ran a total of 4 runs in 5th gear and 2 runs in 6th gear, and the numbers were fairly consistent and definitely showed a higher average than what Chevy is presenting for the vehicle. Now, before we get into the implications, let's talk about the methodology that Chevy uses for rating their engines. They certify through the SAE, which is the Society of Automotive Engineers, and they follow a very strict rule set to determine their numbers. Think of them as an independent third party. These tests don't involve simply hooking up the car and putting the pedal to the metal. Instead, they slowly build up the RPM, allowing for the numbers to stabilize before giving it more acceleration. This process creates a ton of heat, as you can imagine, and obviously produces lower values for horsepower and torque. This may actually explain the massive discrepancy in numbers, but by this much, I'm honestly not too sure, because it almost sounds too good to be true. But then again, everything about this car does seem too good to be true. From the low pricing to the incredibly fast 0 to 60 time of just 2.8 seconds, hell, even the quarter mile time of 11.1 seconds is crazy and honestly fairly scary for any other car that's not named the Corvette C8. As I mentioned earlier, the team at Motortrend ran the dyno 6 times in a row, 4 of which were in the 5th gear and 2 of which were in the 6th gear. The numbers were as follows, and remember, each consecutive run should be lower because of engine strain and heat. For the first run, they got 558 horsepower and 515 pound-feet of torque. For the second, they got 558 and 512. For the third run, they got 561 and 512. And for the fourth run in 5th gear, they got 556 and 523. If you account for drivetrain loss, which we can call at about 15%, then that translates into 654 horsepower and 615 pound-feet of torque, which is just absolutely insane. In 6th gear, the dyno read 478 and 536, and for the last run, also in the 6th gear, it ran 478 and 544, which translates to 561 horsepower and 640 at the crank, but that still doesn't make any sense whatsoever. After multiple phone calls to GM, it turns out the 5th gear is the closest to the 1-to-1 ratio, making these numbers recorded during the dyno runs rather accurate. The engineers at Corvette said there's 2 main reasons for these different numbers. The first is that the car, when it is cold, produces better numbers, and this is something that everybody knows as a car guy. This applies to computers as well. If you provide them with a lot of great cooling, they're going to perform better, and when they are cold, they're going to do better, and once you strain them and put them through the rounds, they're going to get more hot, and that'll produce less favorable results. The strange thing here is that the dyno runs were done 6 times. Surely after 5 runs of full throttle, the engine would have at least gotten warm, maybe even extremely hot. So that doesn't really make sense, and we can probably rule out that explanation. The other explanation they gave us is that the SAE follows a very strict rule set, as I mentioned above, which is why the official numbers from Corvette are low compared to the dyno runs. The engineers also say that it's not uncommon for single chassis dyno pulls to register higher outputs, and it's extremely unlikely any car will ever generate less output than rated by the SAE. Additionally, even if you account for an impossible 0% drivetrain loss figure, the engine still produces too much power. So what gives? Well, first of all, let's take a look at the video that Motortrend released, because we may be able to find an answer or at least get some sort of conclusion from Motortrend themselves. If you guys would like to see the full article and the video in its entirety, you can click the link at the top of the description of this video. So let's go ahead and watch the video, and afterwards we are going to discuss what this means for the Corvette C8, because my god, I am excited if this turns out to be accurate.
I'm Miguel Cortina, Managing Editor of Motortrend en Español.
And I'm Kim Reynolds, Testing Director of Motortrend.
So today we're going to talk about the surprising results that we got from taking the Corvette to the dyno. So we're wrapping up Car of the Year and we have the mid-engine Corvette one more day. We decided to take it to the real MPG test, but turns out that they don't have the right equipment for it. So our plan B is to go to the dyno.
The first question was what gear ratio to use.
Yeah, we called Chris Walton. Chris's best guess was to do it in 5th gear. We did 4 runs in 5th gear, and then runs 5 and 6 were done in 6th gear. I was there with Angus Mackenzie, who's our international bureau chief, and we see ridiculous numbers. In terms of torque, it went from 515 at the wheels, which means it's about 606 pound-feet of torque at the crank. About 558 horsepower, which means after drivetrain losses, it's 650 horsepower. So I think the takeaway here is that the Corvette is producing about 150 more horsepower than what GM is telling us. We couldn't just sit on this and scratch our heads and say this is a ringer. So we called Chevy engineers to find out what was going on.
And they actually found that this engine was well within tolerance, so there was nothing out of sorts with this thing. It wasn't super tuned. It was a very ordinary Corvette engine. So after the conversation with General Motors, what we finally discovered is the difference between the SAE certified measurements that they're reporting and what we saw is the methodology.
The engine was certified by the Society of Automotive Engineers, the SAE. And so the SAE acts like as a third party and follows these super strict rules.
A normal dyno pull, as you witnessed, you put the car on rollers and you tie it down and you run it. The SAE certified method, the car doesn't just accelerate quickly through its RPM range, but it goes through steps where it runs at certain RPM levels all the way up to red line. So that's much more stressful on the engine. It's generating a lot more heat. So you're going to end up with lower numbers.
And so these 495 horsepower and 470 pound-feet of torque are given to Chevy, and so Chevy has to stick with those numbers. It's not Chevy coming out and saying, our car is making this. It's actually the Society of Automotive Engineers saying, this is how much your engine makes.
Right, right. So which of these numbers is true? The 495 that Chevrolet is claiming or the 650 that we saw?
I'm leaning more towards the 650 that we saw, but also to make sure that the car that we got wasn't a ringer. We're going to be following up with this story in the future. So once Corvette owners get their cars, we're going to ask them to come into the same dyno. We'll pay for the dyno runs, and we'll see if their car is making the same amount of horsepower and torque numbers that our Corvette was making.
Right, so it's 650 with a footnote.
Yes, with an asterisk.
Right.
I mean, regardless if your Corvette has 495 horsepower or 650, you're still getting a really good car that drives amazing.
Yeah, a car that does 2.8 seconds to 60 miles per hour, that's the number that really matters.
So now that you guys have heard from Motortrend, what do you think about the horsepower and torque numbers that have been shown through this dyno? Do you believe it? Do you think there was some sort of mistake in terms of the dyno, or maybe the settings incorrectly programmed? I'm not too sure, guys, but all I'll say is that these numbers seem a little bit far-fetched. Sure, Motortrend is definitely a very credible company, and I think that the dyno was probably set up correctly, but it just doesn't seem like this is very likely. Simply because if the base model is this good, then the Z06 and ZR1 must be miles better than this in terms of the power output. And so we'd be looking at likely a Z06 with 800 horsepower and a ZR1 with 1,000 or maybe even more horsepower than that. And that just seems like something that will never happen, or at least not happen for a very long time. Who knows though? Chevrolet has been absolutely killing it these past few months, and they've been surprising everybody. They go for the mid-engine look. The price, of course, don't get me started on the price of this car. It is very affordable and it's definitely a bargain. And of course, the 0 to 60 time is pretty insane. The quarter mile is great. So who knows? Maybe they'll surprise everyone with this as well, and the horsepower numbers will be a lot higher than what they're actually promoting. But still, we do have to remain skeptical simply because this is one car on one dyno and one company was doing the testing of the vehicle. If we do have more Corvettes, in the coming months coming out on different dynos and they're pulling similar numbers, then we can finally say that yes, the Corvette C8 is one of the most underrated horsepower and torque cars on the market. But until that day, we're just gonna have to wait and see. But still, this is just great news coming out of Motortrend. I want to give them a massive shout out for the video and article. The link will be in the description as always, guys. And again, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. I'm really dying to know what you guys think. As always, drop a like if you enjoyed today's video, subscribe for more Corvette C8 content, and we will see you all in the next one. Peace.